The torch hit the granary roof just as Isaac Easton was hauling the last crate of lamp oil up the lighthouse stairs, and the explosion of light and heat knocked him sideways against the iron railing hard enough to rattle every bone in his body. He steadied himself, gripped the rail, and looked out across the headland. Down in the valley below, past the rolling edge of golden wheat that stirred and whispered even in the summer heat, one of the grain storage barns along the plateau road was burning. Not just smoldering. Burning great churning columns of orange fire reaching up like something furious had clawed its way out of the earth, and even from 200 feet up the lighthouse tower, Isaac could hear the distant roar of it on the wind. He did not waste time wondering. He set down the crate, made sure the lamp was primed and burning steady, and descended the spiral stairs 3 steps at a time. The headland of Cape Marin was his whole world, and had been for 3 years. The lighthouse stood at the very crown of the stone bluff overlooking the Grayville Straits, and below it the land sloped westward into the Jelland Plateau, a vast, impossibly flat country of turning windmills and golden wheat, broken only by the road that wound through from the coast town of Harwick all the way north to the border provinces. It was honest country, hard country. Isaac had taken the lighthouse posting because he'd needed work, and because the solitude had not frightened him the way it frightened other men. He was 28, unmarried, of no remarkable quality and no remarkable failing. He kept the light burning. The ship stayed off the rocks. That was enough. Or it had been enough, until the purge wardens had come through Harwick 6 weeks ago. They called themselves the Commission of Purity, which was the kind of name that made sensible men want to find somewhere else to be. They were 3 officials out of the inland city of Verath, traveling with a guard detail of 12 soldiers, and they had been systematically working their way through every settlement on the plateau road, cataloging any person who was not of full human blood. Their language was careful and bureaucratic. Their intent was not. People disappeared into their custody. Nobody official explained what happened after that. Nobody unofficial dared ask. Isaac had first heard about it from the supply wagon that came up to the lighthouse every 2 weeks. The wagoner, a cheerful heavyset man named Gerald, had not been cheerful that day. He'd kept his voice low and his eyes moving. "They burned out a half-blood family near Thresket," Gerald had said, handing up the oil casks. "Mother was Partork. They took the father too just for being married to her. Said he was a collaborator. That's what they're calling it now. Collaborators." Isaac had thought about that word for 2 weeks straight. He thought about it now, running down the switchback path from the lighthouse base toward the plateau road, the fire on the horizon growing larger and painting the undersides of the evening clouds a sickly copper. He reached the road in 11 minutes at a full run. The burning barn was a 1/4 mile east, and he could see figures moving against the light, some trying to throw water, most just watching, a few on horseback keeping their distance with the deliberate stillness of men who want to look uninvolved. He ran toward it because 3 years of lighthousekeeping made running toward fire automatic. You went toward the danger. That was the job. He was 50 yards from the barn when he saw her. She was stumbling out of the tree line that edged the east side of the grain field, and she was covered in ash. Not a little ash. Not the tasteful sort of gray smudge that a story might give a woman to make her seem attractively disheveled. She was gray from her hairline to her belt, her face and neck and the strong bare column of her arms dusted so thick with it that, when she shook her head, a small cloud of it puffed and caught the firelight like powdered gold. There was a burned patch along her left forearm, and a cut above her right brow that had traced a dark line through the ash down the side of her face. She was breathing hard, moving fast, and she was absolutely enormous, taller than any man standing near the fire, built like someone had taken a sculptor's ideal of strength, and then said, "No more," and her tusks caught the firelight in 2 sharp white curves below a full, set, determined mouth. She was wearing fitted travel leathers the color of dark evergreen, a close-cut bodice laced up the front with cord, snug trousers tucked into low-knee boots, a belt hung with a short curved blade on one hip, and an empty sheath on the other where something had been lost or taken. The leathers were scorched across the shoulder, and the ash had settled into every crease and fold, and there was a tear along her right hip where the leather had been grabbed or caught on something. None of it mattered. None of it diminished her by so much as an inch. Isaac stopped walking. He could not entirely explain why he stopped. His feet simply found the ground and stayed there, and he stared, and the fire behind her lit her in orange and gold, and every coherent thought he owned went briefly sideways. She was the finest thing he had ever seen. He was aware, distantly, that this was probably not the appropriate primary reaction to a woman clearly fleeing danger and covered in the evidence of catastrophe. He was also aware that she had caught his look, not accidentally. She had turned her head as she moved, scanning the road, doing the quick threat assessment that any sensible person did when they emerged from cover into an open space, and her eyes had found him and stopped. They were dark green, her eyes, the color of deep water under pine shade. And they held his gaze with an absolute, unhurried confidence that should have been impossible in a woman who had just come out of a burning building, or near enough to one, and was clearly running from something that wanted her captured or dead. She did not look away first. Neither did he. "You," she said, and her voice was low and clear, carrying easily over the distant crackle of the fire. "Are you part of them?" He realized he was still staring. He pulled himself together. "Part of who?" "The wardens." "The commission." She said the word like it tasted bad. "No." He took a step toward her, then stopped, because she had shifted her weight to the balls of her feet and her hand had moved toward the hilt of the remaining blade, and he understood immediately that she was very capable of using it. "My name is Isaac Easton. I keep the lighthouse up on the headland. I saw the fire and came down." She studied him for a moment that felt considerably longer than it probably was. The firelight moved across her face, through all that gray ash, and it did absolutely nothing to diminish the severe and arresting quality of her. "The wardens burned my camp," she said. 2 hours east on the road. They had a list. My name was on it." She paused. "I ran. They had horses. I went into the trees and they couldn't follow. Then something in the camp caught and the whole hillside lit up and she gestured at herself, a short economical gesture that acknowledged the ash without apologizing for it. "Are you hurt?" Isaac said. She looked at her burned arm. "Yes." "How bad?" "Bad enough to need wrapping, not bad enough to slow me down." "Come up to the lighthouse," Isaac said. "I've got a medicine kit. You can rest, clean up, and figure out where to go." The green eyes measured him again. "Why?" "Because you're hurt and they're coming after you, and I have a lighthouse that sits on a 200-foot cliff that only one road reaches, and I know every foot of that road." He paused. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you the geometry." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly. More like a recalibration, the subtle adjustment of someone who has been expecting hostility and has just encountered something that doesn't fit that expectation. "Rasha Wildheart," she said. "That's my name. Pleased to meet you, Rasha." She fell into step beside him, and they moved fast back along the road toward the lighthouse path, and Isaac did not look back at the fire. He learned the essential shape of her story in pieces on the climb up the switchback. She was a scout, had been a scout, for a clan whose lands lay 3 days north of the plateau. She'd come south alone, which was unusual, because she'd been carrying a message from her clan chief to a trade contact in Harwick, and the clan preferred to send individual runners for diplomatic work rather than war bands, which drew the wrong kind of attention. She had arrived in the area 4 days ago. She had heard about the commission sweep 2 days ago. She had tried to stay off the road and travel through the tree line, but someone, a farmer, she thought, or a farmhand who'd seen her passing had sent word ahead, and the wardens had ridden out with dogs. "Dogs," she said flatly, as if this detail personally offended her. "Did they catch your scent?" "They caught the scent of the trail I'd been using. I circled back through the creek bed and they lost it, but they found my camp and burned it." She paused. "I had the message in my pack." "If they have it, what was in the message?" "Trade terms. Food surplus from the northern clans in exchange for iron goods out of Harwick." She looked at him sidelong. "Do you understand what that means?" "In the current climate, He did. A written negotiation between an orc clan and a human trading house was exactly the kind of thing the Commission would cite as evidence of conspiracy. It would give them legal, or at least official justification to extend their sweep north, to declare the plateau clans a threat rather than simply an inconvenient presence. It could light a much larger fire than the one burning down on the road. "We need to get that message," Isaac said. Rasha stopped walking. She turned to face him on the narrow path, the lighthouse lamp throwing its slow revolving beam out over the dark straits far above them, and she looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize as her version of careful attention. "You said we," she observed. "I did. You don't know me. You don't owe my clan anything." "No," Isaac agreed. "But the Commission has been working its way through this plateau for 6 weeks. 2 days ago they took a family from Thresket. A week before that they took a glassblower from Hartmere who had a grandmother from the southern Riverork bands. She was 50 years old and she'd lived in Hartmere her whole life. He met her eyes in the dark. I've been keeping a lighthouse and keeping my head down and telling myself it wasn't my problem. I'm tired of that." Rasha was quiet for a moment, then she resumed climbing. "They'll have the pack in their camp," she said, "east side of the road, about 1.5 miles past the burn site. They set up a command post each night, tents a fire. The captain keeps the confiscated materials in a lockbox in the main tent." "How do you know that?" "I watched them for 2 days before they found me." Isaac absorbed this. The woman had been conducting her own intelligence operation while being hunted. He filed that away. She wound the burned arm herself once they reached the lighthouse, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, while Isaac held the lamp and handed her the clean linen strips from the medicine tin. The burn was genuine, a wide raw patch along the inside of her forearm, and she wrapped it without flinching or making any sound about it, which impressed him even though he tried not to let it show on his face. "You look worried," she said, without looking up from the wrapping. "I'm thinking. About the message. About the Commission. They've got 12 soldiers. Even if we get the message back, they know you're somewhere in this area. They're not going to stop looking." She tied off the bandage with her teeth and straightened. In the confined space of the lighthouse keeper's ground floor room, his small, practical home of a stone fireplace, a wooden table, a cot, shelves of oil and lamp equipment, she was magnificently out of scale. Not uncomfortably, just massively, impressively present the way a good piece of architecture was present. "There's a magistrate at Harwick," she said. "His name is Corvin. He's old, he's been on the plateau his whole life, and he predates the Commission by 30 years. My clan chief has a correspondence with him. That's who the message was going to. If I can get to Corvin before the Commission does, and if I can tell him what they've been doing on the plateau, he has the authority to challenge their mandate. Technically, if he's willing. Is he? I don't know. I've never met him." A pause. "But I know he's the only legal authority in this region that outranks them." Isaac sat down on the edge of the table. Outside, the revolving lamp swept its long arm over the dark water, steady and certain as a heartbeat. It was the most reliable thing he owned, that light. He had kept it burning through storms that had thrown waves halfway up the cliff face, through winter gales that had made the whole tower shudder and keen, through 3 years of solitude. He knew how to hold a course. "Then we go to Harwick," he said, "but we get the message first." "That is a significant risk," Rasha said. "I know. They have 12 armed men." "I know." She looked at him with those deep green eyes, and the firelight from the small hearth played across her ash-dusted face, and she was so thoroughly, overwhelmingly beautiful that Isaac had to work to keep his expression professionally neutral, which was considerably harder than it should have been. "Why?" she asked again. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "Because I'm tired of the light going out," he said. He nodded upward toward the lamp room above. "I don't mean literally, I mean," he stopped, started again. "There are things worth keeping burning, you understand." She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I understand. They didn't attempt the Commission's camp that night. It would have been foolish. 12 soldiers alert after a chase through the woods, the camp just set, guards posted." Instead, Isaac watched the light make its rounds and Rasha slept on his cot for 4 hours. which she did without ceremony or apparent self-consciousness, removing her belt and boots and lying down in her ash-dusted leathers as if she had been sleeping in strange places her whole life, which Isaac supposed she had. He sat at the table and tried to think strategically and mostly watched the revolving beam and the way the firelight caught the line of her jaw. She woke at the 3rd hour before dawn and found him exactly where she'd left him. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I'm the lighthouse keeper. I don't sleep until the lamp does." She sat up and reached for her boots. "Tell me about the road between here and the commission's camp. Every detail." He told her. He knew the plateau road intimately, 3 years of walking it to meet the supply wagon, of knowing where it flooded in spring, and where the windmill tracks crossed it, which farmsteads sat close enough to be seen, and which were hidden behind the long grass. He drew her a map on the back of a supply receipt, a rough but honest map, and she studied it with the same complete focus she had given him on the path. "There," she said, pointing, "this bend, where the road curves around the grain store. Old Fenwick's store. He keeps it locked all season. The commission's camp is just past it. They'll have a man on the roadside. But if we come through the grain field from the windmill track, we can approach the back of the tents," Isaac finished. "Can you move quietly? I grew up hunting rabbits on the moors." "Yes." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor to one, the shape of a smile in rehearsal, and it did something to his chest that he elected not to examine too carefully. They went out into the pre-dawn dark. The plateau at that hour was extraordinary. Isaac had seen it 1,000 times from the lighthouse height. The long, flat, golden country stretching away from the coast. The windmills turning slow and dark against the sky, but walking through it at ground level. Moving fast and low through the shoulder-high wheat with the grain heads brushing cold and heavy against his arms, was something else entirely. Rasha moved ahead of him and she was almost silent, her big frame somehow making no sound in the wheat that he could not also make himself disappear into. And twice, she stopped and turned and put her hand flat against his chest to hold him still while something passed on the road. Once a rider, once a patrol on foot, and both times she had sensed them before he had. Her hand on his chest was warm and remarkably certain. They found the back of the commission's camp through a gap in a windbreak of planted willows, and Rasha crouched and made him crouch beside her while they watched the layout. A fire, burning low. 2 large canvas tents, a rope picket of horses. One man walking a slow circuit of the camp. One man seated at the fire, not sleeping but not alert either, his chin dipping toward his chest. "Main tent," she murmured. "Left side, the lockbox will be near the captain's bedroll. How are we getting in without waking the captain?" "The captain is the man at the fire," she said. "He's having trouble sleeping, which means his tent is empty." Isaac looked. She was right. The man at the fire was better dressed than a common guard, with the square-buckled coat of a commission official, and he was staring into the coals with the hollow eyes of a man whose conscience was bothering him, or whose ambition was. Either way, his tent was empty. They moved on a count of 3, and Rasha went through the gap between the tents like water through a crack, and Isaac followed. Inside, it was dark, but the fire outside gave just enough dim light through the canvas to work by. The lockbox was exactly where she'd predicted, a banded iron chest about the size of a bread loaf, with a key lock. Rasha looked at it, looked at Isaac. Isaac looked at it, and then at the small folding tool kit on his belt. Lighthouse equipment, because the lighthouse was full of small locks and mechanisms. He pulled out a long, thin pick he used for the lamp governor, and went to work on the lockbox while Rasha stood at the tent gap watching the guard circuit. The lock was better than he expected. It took him 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes and 40 seconds longer than he wanted it to take, and his hands were sweating. And at one point, Rasha made a small, sharp sound and pressed herself against the canvas, and he held completely still for 30 seconds while the guard's footsteps went past and receded. The lock gave. Inside the box was a sheaf of documents. Isaac could not read most of them in the dark, but Rasha found what she was looking for in seconds. a folded paper sealed with what had been her clan chief's mark, now broken, which told him the commission had already read it. She tucked it inside her bodice with a quiet, satisfied motion. He relocked the box. She raised an eyebrow. "They'll know it was opened when they check the contents," he whispered. "They'll know either way when they realize the message is gone," she whispered back. "Better they take longer to notice." They got out the same way they'd come in. They were back on the windmill track and moving fast northward before the sky had lightened enough to show color, and neither of them said anything until they were a full mile from the camp, at which point Isaac exhaled a very long breath and Rasha made a sound that was low and warm and amused, not quite a laugh but close enough to one that it made him turn and look at her. She was looking at him already. "You're good at that," she said. "Picking locks. Staying calm. Keeping your hands steady." "I keep a lighthouse. Everything that can go wrong eventually goes wrong in a lighthouse, and you learn not to shake while you're fixing it." She kept looking at him, and the sky behind her was beginning to go from black to that particular heavy blue of earliest morning, and it lit the edges of her, the strong line of her shoulder, the angle of her jaw, the puff and coil of her dark hair, and he found himself thinking that this was not at all like 3 years of solitude. This was nothing like that. They went back to the lighthouse to collect his things. Isaac packed light and practically. A week's worth of dried food, the medicine kit, his traveling coat, money he kept in an oil tin under the floorboards, a modest amount but honest, and his tools. He kept a good knife. He added that. Rasha watched him pack with her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. "You don't have to come all the way to Harwick," she said. "I know. The commission won't have any particular reason to go after you if I leave now. You could go back to keeping your lighthouse and they'd never know you helped." Isaac closed the traveling pack and slung it over his shoulder. "Come on," he said. "We've got a long walk." She did not argue. He chose to count that as a point in his favor. Harwick was 22 miles by the Plateau Road and another 4 through the coast town's northern approach, and they didn't dare take the road directly. Rasha knew enough of the commission's patterns to know they sent riders ahead of their main movement to check towns for people on their list, which meant the road itself was compromised. They went instead through the grain fields, parallel to the road but out of sight of it, following the line of windmills that marked the irrigation channels north to south across the plateau. It was, Isaac had to admit, extraordinarily beautiful country to be moving through under these circumstances. The windmills were old, some of them predating anyone's memory, built from stone and seasoned timber that had gone iron-gray with age, their sails turning with a deep wooden creak that carried across the flat land like something between a heartbeat and a sigh. The wheat was tall and ripe, weeks from harvest, and it moved in long gold waves with every gust off the coast. The sky was enormous and very blue. He told her this, and she looked at him with a slightly startled expression. "You're describing scenery," she said. "It's good scenery. We're being pursued. All the more reason to notice it," he said. "If something is beautiful, you should look at it." She was quiet for a pace or two. "Then my people say the same thing. We say a warrior who does not stop to see the country she's moving through is already half defeated, because you fight for what you can see. What you can't see, you can only protect in the abstract. That's a good way to think about it. My clan chief says it. He's a wise man." She paused. "He'll be worried about the message. We'll get it to Corvin. You say that with a great deal of confidence." "I have a great deal of confidence," Isaac said. "That's what keeps the light burning when the storms come in." She turned to look at him as they walked, and something in her expression had shifted again, more open than before, the high wall of her self-containment showing a small, deliberate door. "Tell me about the storms," she said. So he told her. He described the winter gales that came off the straits with all the force of something that didn't have a name for it in human language, the waves that climbed the cliff and threw spray high enough to strike the lamp room glass, the way the whole tower rang like a bell in the worst of them. He described sitting in the lamp room and holding the mechanism steady by hand when the governor froze, and watching through the rain-blurred glass as a ship he could barely see made its turn away from the rocks, safe, which was the whole point of everything. She listened with her full attention, that same quality of absolute reception she brought to everything, and it occurred to him that in 3 years he had never had anyone to tell these things to. He was almost embarrassed by how good it felt. In return, she told him about the North, the plateau from the Orc clan's perspective, the great flat stretches that his people called empty and hers called home. She described the seasonal migrations her people made across the plateau interior, following the game and the water, and the way the clan made camp in the old style with hide tents and cook fires, and how different that was from the permanent settlements the human towns had built, and how she'd always moved between those two worlds with a kind of restless ease that she'd never quite been able to explain to anyone on either side. "You're a person between places," he said. She looked at him sharply as if the exactness of it surprised her. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I am." "Me too," he said. "The lighthouse isn't a place, it's a function. I keep the light. The place is just the mechanism." The understanding that passed between them in that moment was quiet and complete. They stopped at midday in the shadow of a tall windmill, far enough off the road to be out of sight, and shared food from Isaac's pack: hard bread, dried salt fish, an apple he'd had since the last supply wagon. Rasha ate efficiently and without complaint, and when she handed back the water flask she let her fingers rest against his for a moment, just a moment, and met his eyes with a directness that made it very clear the gesture was not accidental. "You're staring at me again," she said. "I'm aware. You stared at me like that on the road, when I came out of the trees. I know, there was no point in pretending. I couldn't help it." She tilted her head. "Most humans look at me and they're afraid or hostile or both. I know what I looked like," he said. "It wasn't fear." She was still watching him, and the midday sun came through the windmill's turning shadow and striped her face in moving bars of light and dark, and he could see where the ash had mostly brushed from her skin now except in the creases and along her hairline, and the cut above her brow had dried to a thin dark line, and she was so thoroughly, arrestingly herself that it took real effort to look away. She leaned forward very slightly. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." They were close enough that he could have closed the distance with very little effort. He could see that she was entirely aware of this. He could also see, with considerable clarity, that the decision of whether to close it was being offered to him, and that she would think less of him if he spent too long deliberating. He closed the distance. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss that acknowledges something real, warm and unhurried and very direct, and when it ended she did not pull back but rested her forehead briefly against his, her eyes still closed, and he could feel her exhale slow and deliberate, like something she'd been holding. "We should keep moving," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another 30 seconds. They made 12 miles before dark and sheltered that night in an empty windmill storage shed, the kind of outbuilding attached to the bigger mill stations, used for tool storage in season, empty now with harvest still weeks off. It was small and smelled of old grain dust and machine oil, and Rasha sat with her back against the shed wall and Isaac sat beside her and their shoulders were touching, and the closeness of it in the small dark space was warm and uncomplicated and good. She fell asleep against his shoulder. He stayed awake for a while, listening to the creak of the mill above them and the occasional sound of the plateau wind moving through the wheat, and felt the weight of her leaning against him like something he'd been missing for a long time without knowing what it was. He woke to her hand on his jaw. "Time to move," she said. Her voice was very close. Her hand remained where it was for just a moment longer than the waking required. "Good morning," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They were careful and fast through the second day, moving hard, covering ground. The commission's pattern, which Rasha had observed in careful detail, was to sweep ahead by rider and behind by main column, which meant the area they'd left behind was likely tightening, but they were ahead of that tightening and moving the right direction. The trick was to reach Harwick before the commission's advance riders checked in with the town's established contacts and put the magistrate on notice. There were a few moments of held breath. A cavalry patrol passing close on the road, visible through the wheat stalks as a line of gray shapes. A farmstead checkpoint, not official commission, just local men with armbands and nervous energy, doing what frightened people do when an authority gives them permission to be frightened officially. Rasha went flat in the wheat, and Isaac walked past the checkpoint alone, nodding at the men, answering that he was a lighthouse keeper come down on supply business, which was true enough not to feel like a lie. The farmstead men let him through, and he circled around and found her waiting a quarter-mile past, crouched between two windmill sheds, doing something with her belt buckle that turned out to be carving a small notch in the leather, a habit, she explained, when she needed to do something with her hands while waiting. "I counted 12 marks," Isaac said, noting the leather. "Yes. How many of those were waiting for someone you trusted?" She looked at the buckle, then at him. "0, she said. "Until now." He reached out and touched her face, just briefly, tucking a loose strand of hair back from her temple. She turned into the touch without seeming to mean to, a small involuntary motion, and then looked slightly annoyed at herself for it. He smiled. She pointed at the road. They kept moving. They reached the outskirts of Harwick on the afternoon of the third day, coming in along the coastal approach that wound down from the plateau edge through a series of lower bluffs. The town was a proper settlement, stone buildings, a market square, a harbor district below, and above that the older civic quarter with the magistrate's hall, the record house, and the salt merchants' guild hall, all built from the same dark stone and overlooking each other in the careful way of buildings that have coexisted for generations. Isaac had been to Harwick perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. He knew it well enough. More importantly, he knew how to walk into a place where he was occasionally recognized without attracting the wrong kind of attention, which was a lighthouse keeper's skill that translated well. They came in separately. Isaac went first, bought a loaf of bread from a stall at the market edge and walked casually north to the civic quarter, and Rasha followed 20 minutes later through the harbor district alleys, which were older and less observed. She was waiting in the arch of the record house when he arrived. "Any sign of the commission's riders?" she said. "One man in a gray coat talking to the harbor mistress," Isaac said. "He looked official." "I kept moving." Rasha nodded. "Corvin's Hall. We go now." Magistrate Corvin's Hall was not grand. It was the kind of administrative building that had been practical once and had become, through the accumulation of decades and paperwork, also accidentally dignified. The oak door was heavy and old, and it opened when they knocked. The aide who answered looked at Isaac, then at Rasha, and his face did the quick sequence of expressions: surprise, uncertainty, and something close to alarm before he recovered into professional blankness. "We're here to see the magistrate," Isaac said. "My name is Isaac Easton. I keep the Cape Marin Lighthouse. We have a matter of official urgency regarding the Commission of Purity's activities on the Plateau Road." The aide took them through a narrow corridor to a waiting room. They waited for 11 minutes. Rasha stood very still during all 11 of them, her arms at her sides, her chin level. She had removed most of the remaining ash on the road into town, wiping her face and arms with the damp cloth Isaac had handed her from the water flask, and she was herself again, the green eyes and the strong jaw and the full quiet intensity of her, unmistakable and undiluted. Magistrate Corvin was a large man who had once been larger, the kind of age that shrinks a person's body but not their presence, so that he seemed to fill the room by something other than physical dimension. He had white hair, sharp gray eyes, and the hands of a man who had spent decades signing documents, which had given them a particular quality of permanent slight curl. He looked at Rasha without flinching. He looked at Isaac. He sat back in his chair. "Lighthouse keeper," he said, "you've come a long way off your rock." "The commission burned a camp on the Plateau Road 4 days ago," Isaac said. "Rasha Wildheart is a scout and diplomatic runner for the clan Wildheart, operating under a standing trade correspondence with your office. She was on the list." They have been taking people from this plateau for 6 weeks, sir, and what they're calling a purge is going to reach the northern clans within a month if their mandate isn't challenged. I'm aware of the commission, Corvin said. Are you aware of their mandate's geographic limits? Rasha said. She stepped forward and placed the recovered message on the desk. This is the trade correspondence they confiscated from my camp. They had no legal authority to confiscate it. It is a private document between my clan chief and your office, protected under the border trade accords of 4 decades past. She met his eyes evenly. You signed those accords. Your name is on the letter. They took your private correspondence, sir. Corvin looked at the letter. His expression did not change, but something in the set of his jaw did. You recovered this from their lockbox, he said. Yes, Isaac said. That was very foolish. Yes, Isaac agreed, but necessary. Corvin picked up the letter. He read it for a moment. He set it down. The Commission's mandate is issued from the Interior Council under the Purity Resolutions, he said. Challenging it formally requires a full sitting of the Plateau Assembly, which hasn't convened in 2 years. He paused. However, he looked at them. There is an emergency provision for a single magistrate's injunction, valid for a period of 30 days, sufficient to suspend the Commission's operations within my jurisdiction while a formal challenge is prepared. It requires 2 witnesses to an act of jurisdictional overreach by the Commission. He looked at the letter, then at them. And documentary evidence. Isaac and Rasha looked at each other. We're 2 witnesses, Isaac said. And that's documentary evidence, Rasha said, nodding at the letter. The Commission's captain will contest it, Corvin said. He'll request a formal hearing. Under the resolutions, he has a right to it. That means a public proceeding. He looked at Rasha directly. In front of the town council, with the Commission's council present, it will not be comfortable. I'm not easily made uncomfortable, Rasha said. Corvin almost smiled. No, he said. I imagine not. He called for his aide. He began writing. It took 2 days to arrange. 2 days during which Isaac and Rasha stayed at an inn near the harbor, a sensible, low-profile establishment called the Anchor's Rest, run by a woman who had clearly seen enough of life to extend a room to an orc woman and a lighthouse keeper without requiring an explanation. They paid. She provided clean bedrooms and good food, and didn't comment on the bruising around Rasha's wrapped arm or the general quality of purposeful exhaustion they both carried. The first evening, they ate in the common room and Isaac ordered fish stew and brown bread, and they sat across from each other and ate like people who had been on the road for 4 days, which is to say with undisguised enthusiasm, and without conversation, until the immediate urgency of the food was addressed. Then they sat back and looked at each other across the table, and the firelight was warm and the room was quiet, and Isaac thought that of all the things that had surprised him in the past 4 days, this particular ordinary comfortable evening of sitting across a table from her was the one he least expected to feel the way it did. Are you afraid, she asked, of the hearing? Yes, a little, are you? No, she said then. I'm worried that Corvin won't hold, that the Commission's council will make enough noise and he'll back down. I don't think he will. He's old and he's been here a long time and they took his correspondence. Isaac looked at his stew. People who have built something over a long time don't like having it casually disrespected. I think he takes that personally. That's a thin thread to hang a legal challenge on. It's the thread we've got. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. The gesture was unhurried and deliberate, and the warmth of her hand was considerable. You came a long way off your rock, she said, echoing Corvin's words, but with something in her voice that made them mean something different. You asked me why I keep doing this, he said. Why I said we. I've been trying to find the right answer. Have you found it? He turned his hand over under hers. Because before you stumbled out of those trees, he said, I had been alone for 3 years with a perfectly good reason for being alone, and inside 48 hours I cannot currently imagine going back to it. He held her gaze. That's the honest answer. Rasha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, In my clan, when someone chooses a partner, they do not make a ceremony of announcing it to others first. They tell the person directly, and the telling is the choosing. That sounds right, he said. I am telling you, she said carefully, that you are the person I would choose. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which were ash-roughened and bandage-warm and entirely real, and she watched him do it with an expression that was fierce and open and completely unguarded. I would choose you too, he said, the moment I saw you on that road, before you'd said a word. I was covered in ash, she said, and the small note of wry disbelief in her voice made him laugh. Yes, he said, and you were still. He stopped, shook his head. There isn't a word big enough for what you were. She came around the table without any warning or ceremony. She framed his face in her hands and kissed him, deep and slow, and with the absolute certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she wants. And when she finally drew back, he was fairly sure his expression was doing something embarrassing. There, she said, with the small precursor smile that was becoming familiar. Now we both know. The hearing the following day was in the Harwick Council Hall, a broad stone room with a raised dais for the council seats, a long table for the presiding magistrate, and a floor-level standing area for petitioners and respondents. It was built for an audience of 40. By the time Isaac and Rasha arrived with Corvin's aid, there were close to 100 people there. Word had gotten out. That was the thing about small coastal towns. Word always got out. The commission's captain was a man named Albrecht Sane, and he was everything his camp and his soldiers were: sharp-dressed, cold-eyed, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who has been given a charter, and has learned that most people will not challenge a charter, even a dubious one. He arrived with 4 of his soldiers and the commission's legal counsel, a narrow-faced man named Voras, and both of them looked at Rasha when they entered and made the quick calculation: orc, large, female, clearly the subject, that Isaac had been expecting. What he had not been expecting was the crowd. Most of the people filling the hall were plainly town residents, merchants, harbor workers, a few farmers. Some of them looked afraid. Some looked angry. Some looked curious. But there were also, near the back, a cluster of people he recognized from the Plateau Road towns, Thresket, Hartmere, a few from the mill settlements, and they had the exhausted, compressed look of people who had been swallowing something bitter for too long and had come because swallowing any more of it was not an option. Rasha stood straight and still beside Isaac, her arms at her sides, her chin level. She was wearing the same evergreen leathers she'd had on since the ash-covered night on the road, cleaned and relaced now, the burned sleeve repaired with a strip of darker cord. The cut above her brow had healed to a thin scar. She looked exactly like what she was, a person who had been hunted and had not been broken by it. Corvin called the hearing to order. He read the injunction grounds. He read the relevant passages of the border trade accords. He presented the letter. Sane's counsel, Voras, objected immediately. He invoked the commission's mandate under the purity resolutions. He questioned the letter's provenance. How had it come to the magistrate's hands? By what means had it been obtained? It was stolen from a commission lockbox, Corvin said, utterly without inflection. And it was stolen because the commission had previously stolen it from its rightful owner. He held up the letter. This is addressed to this office. It is correspondence between the clan Wildheart and this magistrate's office. Its confiscation constitutes an illegal seizure of official documents. The Commission's mandate does not supersede the border trade accords, which are a foundational agreement of this territory predating the purity resolutions by 31 years. Voras began to speak. Sane put a hand on his arm and spoke himself. "Magistrate," he said, "you're protecting an orc scout who entered this territory without declaration. She entered this territory under the provisions of the trade accords, which require no separate declaration for diplomatic runners," Corvin said. Article 11. Perhaps your commission's briefing materials were incomplete. He set down the letter. Furthermore, I have before me 2 witnesses to the burning of this scout's camp, which was not contraband, not a threat, and not subject to the commission's jurisdiction. I have a witness to the unlawful seizure of correspondence." Sane looked at Isaac. Isaac was aware of the room looking at him. He was aware of 100 people, and Sane's 4 soldiers and Rasha standing at his left shoulder, and the long wall of daylight coming through the hall's high windows. He was aware of being a lighthouse keeper, an ordinary person, of no particular standing or authority, with a pack of tools and a small amount of money and 3 years of keeping a light that mattered. "My name is Isaac Easton," he said. "Cape Marin Lighthouse. I can confirm what the magistrate stated. I was present when the Commission's camp was in possession of that correspondence. I can confirm the scout's identity and her lawful purpose in this territory." He looked at Sane. "And I can also confirm that in the 6 weeks the Commission has been operating on this plateau, they have removed at least 4 families from their homes without formal charge. I know their names if the Council requires them." "Their names are irrelevant," Voras said quickly. "Their names," said a woman near the back, one of the Thresket residents Isaac saw, a farmwife with gray-streaked hair and the posture of someone who had made a decision, "are Felder, and Thorn, and Merritt. And old Lena Glassblower from Hartmere who lived there 50 years. The room changed, not loudly, not with shouting or declaration. It changed the way a room changes when something everyone has been thinking separately is suddenly said aloud by someone, and the realization that it is shared moves through the assembly like a current. More voices gave names. More names. Corvin let it go for a moment. Then he raised his hand and the room quieted. "Captain Sane," he said, "the injunction stands. The Commission's operations within this jurisdiction are suspended pending a full review by the Plateau Assembly, which I am calling under emergency provision effective immediately. Your soldiers will stand down. Your prisoners," and here his voice went very deliberate, "currently held in Commission custody will be presented to this court within 48 hours for individual hearings." He met Sane's eyes, every one of them. Sane looked at the room, at the 100 people, at the names hanging in the air. "This will be appealed," he said. "Yes," Corvin said. "It will, and you are welcome to make your appeal to the Plateau Assembly when it convenes in 3 weeks. He gathered his papers. "In the meantime, stand down, Captain." The moment that followed was very still. Sane's 4 soldiers looked at each other, looked at their captain, looked at the crowd. Sane stood down, not with grace, not with anything that resembled acknowledgement. But he turned and walked toward the hall door with his counsel, and the crowd parted to let him through, and the sound of that many people parting and closing again behind him was one of the most complete sounds Isaac had ever heard. He felt Rasha's hand close around his tight, brief, and enormously warm, and then she released it. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, chin level, but at the corner of her mouth was something that was absolutely, undeniably a smile. The next 3 days in Harwick were not entirely triumph. The Commission's riders were still in the territory. Sane was still present and making his displeasure loudly known, and the injunction was a legal instrument, not an armed force, which meant it could hold the line without guaranteeing that the line would never be tested again. Corvin moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood exactly how narrow his window was, and within those 3 days he had opened proceedings on 4 detained families and issued orders for their release, and had sent dispatch to the Plateau Assembly. It was not the end of the Commission, but it was a stop, and a genuine one, and in a hard world, a genuine stop is not nothing. Rasha spent the 2nd day writing a full account of what had happened, the chase, the camp burning, the confiscation, and presenting it to Corvin's office as a formal deposition. She wrote clearly and precisely in a script Isaac had not known she possessed until he watched her do it, a clean forward-leaning hand that filled page after page with the kind of detail that came from someone who had been trained to observe and report. "You can write," he said, which was not a flattering way to express what he meant. She looked at him over her shoulder. "My clan chief believes that words on paper outlast words in memory," she said. "Every scouting clan Wildheart learns to write before they learn to fight. That's remarkable, Is it? For a scout, yes. Usually scouts learn to run and observe and report verbally. Our chief is a forward-thinking man. She turned back to the page. He also believes that if humans have been using paperwork to bind us to bad agreements for generations, we should at minimum learn to make paperwork work for us. Isaac laughed, genuine and unguarded, and she turned back to give him a look of pleased amusement that was private and warm. He wrote a letter to the Cape Marin Lighthouse Authority, informing them that he would be absent for a period. He arranged with a harbor sailor he trusted to deliver it. The lighthouse would be dark for a while. It would survive. Ships ran this coast in summer with good weather and charts. The darker months would come later. It was, he realized, the first time in 3 years he had considered leaving the lighthouse for longer than a supply run. On the third evening in Harwich, they climbed up through the old civic quarter to the high point of the bluff above the harbor, where a crumbled watchtower had been left to decay into something that was now more viewing platform than fortification. It looked north and west over the straits and east over the beginning of the plateau, and in the late afternoon light the whole country was spread out enormous and golden below them. Rasha stood at the edge and looked north. "I need to get the message to my clan chief," she said. "The trade terms. I also need to bring him the deposition and word of the injunction, and there's a merchant in the northern hill towns who my chief has been trying to reach. The same network the commission was disrupting. If the injunction holds, we can rebuild it." She was thinking out loud, he realized, planning. Working through logistics the way she did, with the concentrated focus of a person who finds comfort in precision. "How long a journey?" Isaac said. "North through the plateau interior, 3 days to the foothills, 2 more to the clan's current camp." She paused. "The route runs through territory the commission's riders know. It's not safe to travel alone." "No," Isaac agreed. She turned to look at him. "Your lighthouse is dark," he said, "and I know every road on this plateau." "You keep saying we," she said, and the way she said it was not a challenge. It was something much warmer than that. "Yes," he said, "I do." She crossed the distance between them in 2 easy steps and took hold of his traveling coat, both lapels, in large hands that knew exactly how to take hold of something, and kissed him in the long light of the late afternoon, with the golden plateau stretching away behind her and the sea wind off the straits lifting her hair. And it was nothing like the careful exploratory kiss of midday on the road. It was the kiss of a woman who has made a decision and is marking it, deep and warm and certain, and when it ended he had both arms around her and no immediate plans to remove them. "In my clan," she said, "when a woman chooses a man, she marks the choosing. What does that mean practically?" She reached up and took something from her belt, a small plaited cord of dark green and gray, the kind of thing he'd have called decorative if he hadn't already learned that nothing on her person was decorative without also being purposeful. She took his wrist and wound it around once, tied it with the quick economy of familiar practice, and let go. He looked at it. It was simple. It was also not nothing. "Green for the plateau," she said. "Gray for the sea, for where you come from and what you've crossed." She held his gaze. "I'll carry mine on the belt where the empty sheath is, the one I lost in the fire." He thought of the empty sheath on her hip, which he'd noticed the first moment he'd seen her. He thought of it now as a space that had been waiting. "Rasha Wildheart," he said. "Isaac Easton," she said back, the way she always said his name, with full weight like it deserved weight. He traced the cord on his wrist with one finger. "For the record," he said, "in lighthouse keeping, when we want to mark something as permanent, we engrave it on the lamp mechanism. Because the lamp mechanism gets inspected every year and the engravings are recorded in the keeper's log. And I intend to put your name in my keeper's log when I get back." She was quiet for a moment. Then the full smile came, not the precursor, not the corner-of-the-mouth hint, but the complete, rare, extraordinary thing, and it was even better than he'd been imagining since the first time he'd seen the precursor. "That is," she said, "a very lighthouse keeper way to declare something." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." They left Harwich the next morning. The road north was different from the road south. They knew each other differently now. moved with the easy synchrony of people who have spent a week in close quarters under pressure, and emerged from it not only intact, but more solid than when they'd started. They still used the windmill tracks rather than the main road. The Commission's injunction was in place, but Sane's riders were still in the territory and neither of them saw any reason to advertise their position. But the movement felt different. Less flight, more something. The plateau in the second week of their travel showed different weather. The coast wind dropped and the heat rose, heavy and golden, and the wheat stood absolutely still in the afternoon heat, so that the whole vast country seemed to be holding its breath. The windmills turned slowly, and the shadow of their sails swept the ground in long, patient circles. On the second morning north of Harwich, they came over a low ridge and the plateau opened below them in a way that had no coastal edge to shorten it, just grain and sky, and the far dark line of the foothills, miles and miles away, with the windmills standing at their regular intervals like sentinels who had been standing long enough to stop being surprised by anything. Rasha stopped and stood very still. "What?" Isaac said. "I grew up seeing this view from the other side," she said. "From the north coming south. I've crossed this plateau maybe 30 times." She was quiet. "I never saw it with someone standing next to me." He stood next to her. "How is it?" "Better," she said simply. They moved on. At midday they came upon a checkpoint that had not been there before. 3 men with the Commission's armbands, not soldiers, the informal kind that local frightened people put on to feel like authority. They were stationed where the windmill track crossed the main road and they had a rope across the track. Rasha went still. Isaac felt her weight shift. "Let me talk," he said quietly. "Isaac, I know what I'm doing." He walked forward ahead of her. The 3 men looked at him, and then past him at Rasha, and the expressions went through their reliable sequence. "Lighthouse keeper out of Cape Marin," Isaac said. He pulled out the papers Corvin had given them, a travel warrant, issued under the magistrate's injunction, explicitly authorizing the movement of Rasha Wildheart, diplomatic runner for Clan Wildheart, through the plateau territory under the provisions of the border trade accords. Corvin had thought ahead. Isaac had been grateful. He held the papers up. "Magistrate Corvin's warrant. If you'd like to hold the rope another 30 seconds I can wait, but I'd prefer not to be on this road after dark, so I'd appreciate if you'd read it quickly." The man in the center took the papers. He was not a legal scholar, which was obvious, but he could read well enough, and the magistrate's seal was large and clear and official, and the Commission's name was also on the papers in the section that cited the accords superseding their authority, which Isaac had noticed Corvin take particular satisfaction in including. The man read. His expression moved from authority to uncertainty to the slightly deflated quality of someone who has been standing in the way of something legitimate. The rope came down. "Thank you," Isaac said, took back the papers and walked through without looking back. Rasha fell into step beside him and kept the same unhurried pace until they were well past the checkpoint, and then she said, very quietly, "That was extremely well done." "I have good documentation," he said, in a very calm voice. "Lighthouse keepers speak to harbor masters. Harbor masters are almost universally terrifying. 3 men with a rope are not terrifying." She made the warm, low sound that was not quite a laugh, close to his shoulder, and he was very aware of exactly how pleased he was to have done something that earned it. The foothills came up on the 3rd afternoon, changing from the flat gold of the plateau into something rougher and more vertical scrub pine and gray rock. The land folded in on itself, streams appearing between boulders with the shock of cold noise. The windmills ended at the plateau edge and there were no more of them, and Isaac felt their absence more than he'd expected. He'd grown used to the sight of them. The road north became a track, and the track became a trail, and Rasha led now with the ease of someone reading a landscape she knew in her bones. She named things as they walked, a particular rock formation her people called the Sentinel's Jaw, a stream she'd forded as a child on her first scouting journey south, a copse of white-barked trees where the clan had once made a winter camp. She was different in this country. Not more herself, exactly. She had been completely herself from the first moment, but more at ease, in the way that people are when they are on familiar ground, the minor tensions of foreignness gone out of their posture. On the fourth night they camped at the edge of a pine wood, a small fire under a clear sky dense with stars, and Rasha made tea from trail herbs she'd gathered along the way. And Isaac watched her move around the fire and thought about how the arc of the past 8 days was the most alive he had felt in 3 years, possibly longer. She poured the tea into the 2 tin cups he'd brought and sat beside him, close enough that their knees touched, and gave him his cup with the straightforward practicality that characterized everything she did. "Do you have a home?" she asked. "Beyond the lighthouse?" "No, I grew up in a fishing village on the southern coast. My parents are gone. I have a sister in the city, but we've not been close for a long time." He thought about it. "The lighthouse is the closest thing I've had to a home in years." "A home you're currently away from?" "Yes." "Is that—" She stopped, chose her words. "Are you sad about that?" He looked at the tea, then at her. "The lighthouse is where I keep the light," he said. "The light keeps the ships off the rocks. That's real and it's good." He met her eyes. "But the lighthouse isn't warm. I've been in it for 3 years and it was never warm." Rasha was quiet. "I'm not sad," he said. "I'm further from lonely than I've been since I can remember." He paused. "Where do you call home, if not the clan camp?" She thought about it with the honesty she brought to everything. "Anywhere that I can see the whole sky," she said at last. "The plateau qualifies. The northern highlands qualify." She looked up at the star-thick dark above the pines. "Anywhere large and open." She glanced at him. "It is convenient that you live on a headland." "Very convenient." She set down her cup and turned to face him fully, and the fire light was warm and the stars were enormous, and she reached up and touched the cord on his wrist. "Tell me what you want," she said. "When this is done, when the message is delivered and the injunction has done what it can, tell me what you actually want." The directness of it hit him square. It was, he thought, the most honest question anyone had ever asked him, and it deserved an equally honest answer. "I want to keep the lighthouse," he said, "because it matters, but I want someone to come home to when I come down off the rock." He held her gaze. "I want it to be you." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. A night bird called somewhere in the pines. "I travel," she said. "My work is travel. I can't promise to be at a fixed point. I know I'll be gone for weeks at a time, months. I know I'm a lighthouse keeper. I'm used to watching for returns." The corner of her mouth. "And when I come back?" "When you come back," he said, "the light will be on." She leaned forward and kissed him again, and this time it was slow and unhurried and entirely private, the way things are when there's no audience and no reason to stop, and the fire burned down while they were busy with each other, and the stars wheeled overhead, and it was good. It was thoroughly, deeply good. They reached the clan camp on the 5th day. The clan Wildheart had set their summer camp in a wide highland meadow backed by a rock face that provided shelter from the north wind. It was larger than Isaac had imagined, 30 or 40 hide tents in the old round style, cook fires, horses on a rope line, children and dogs, and the general organized noise of a community. The people who turned to look as Rasha walked in were large and green-eyed like her, or darker-skinned with different colorings, but all with the same quality of confident physical presence. Isaac was aware that he was the only human. He was also aware, peripherally and pleasantly, that he was walking beside Rasha Wildheart with her clan cord on his wrist, which probably communicated something clear and unambiguous to everyone watching. Rasha's clan chief was named Garrow Wildheart, her father's elder brother. She had told him on the road, a man who had led the clan for 20 years. He was immense even by clan standards, gray-haired and gray-tusked, with the deliberate stillness of a person who has learned that their physical presence does enough of the talking. He came out of the main tent and looked at Rasha with an expression that moved quickly through relief, then assessment, then a longer look at Isaac beside her. "You went for a message," Garrow said. "You brought a lighthouse keeper." "I brought both," Rasha said. She held out the trade letter recovered from the commission's lockbox, now enclosed in a sealed packet from Corvin's office with the full accounting of the injunction. The message, and more besides. Garrow took the packet. He did not open it immediately. He was looking at Isaac. Isaac Easton, he said, which meant Rasha had sent word ahead, or he'd been thoroughly briefed in the last 90 seconds by someone who'd seen the cord, or both. Sir, Isaac said. My niece is selective, Garrow said. She has been selective her entire life. In 29 years she has never brought anyone here. Isaac was briefly at a loss. Rasha, beside him, was making no move to rescue him from this. Suspected she thought it was entertaining. I understand that, Isaac said. I count it as a considerable, he stopped. As the most considerable thing that's ever happened to me. Garrow looked at the cord on Isaac's wrist, looked at the space on Rasha's belt where she'd wound a matching cord, looked at his niece. Rasha met his gaze with the unflinching calm she brought to everything, and something passed between them that Isaac couldn't entirely read. A long look, wordless, and waited, and then Garrow nodded once. A short, definitive nod. Come in, he said. There's food, and I want to hear about this injunction. They spent 3 days at the clan camp. Garrow read the packet thoroughly and had a long formal consultation with Rasha and Isaac both present, at which Isaac contributed his account of the hearing and the legal mechanics of the challenge, and Garrow asked precise, intelligent questions and made notes in a small book, and by the end of it had a clearer picture of both the threat and the opening than anyone else on the plateau. Corvin can hold for 30 days, Garrow said. The assembly will convene and the commission will argue their case. And the assembly will decide, Rasha said. Yes, Garrow looked at his notes. We need the merchant network intact when that decision comes down. If the trade accords are visibly functioning, if human merchants and clan runners are actively using them, it makes the commission's argument for isolation harder to sustain. He looked at Isaac. You said there's a trading house in the hill towns. Rasha said, Isaac corrected. She knows the contacts. I can reach them, Rasha said. That's the next piece. Yes, Garrow said. It is. He closed the notebook. Go, do it, and bring me word when it's done. On the second evening at camp, after the formal meetings and before sleep, Isaac sat outside the guest tent on a flat rock with a lamp he'd repaired during the afternoon. One of the clan's travel lanterns, the wick mechanism jammed, which he'd fixed in 20 minutes out of habit, and Rasha came and sat beside him on the rock. She leaned her head against his shoulder without prelude. He put his arm around her. They sat that way for a long while, watching the highland dark settle over the meadow and the cook fires burning down, and the horses moving quietly on the rope line. My uncle likes you, she said. He barely said 6 words to me that weren't about the commission. For him, that's affection. He pressed his lips to her temple. She turned her face into the touch. I've been thinking about what you said, she said, what you want, and I want the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. I want to come back to the lighthouse. I want to stand on that headland and see the light burning and know that you put it there and that you'll be there. She paused. I want to leave and come back. That's what I want. The leaving I know how to do. The coming back to something that I want to learn. He thought about the lighthouse in the dark, the pale stone tower against the coast sky, the lamp turning in its slow, steady circle, the path down the headland and up again. The headland has a cottage as well, he said, attached to the lighthouse base. There are 2 rooms. I use one for storage. He kept his voice practical. I could clear the storage room. For what? She said. For you, he said. When you come back. She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. She was studying him with the same careful attention she'd given him on the road, on the first night, in the dark outside the warden's camp. That quality of looking that did not miss anything. You're asking me, she said slowly, to live with you. I'm suggesting a logistical arrangement, he said gravely, for a diplomatic runner who needs a base of operations near the coast. The full smile came, without preamble or warning, the complete, extraordinary smile, and it was better every time. She took his face in her hands the way she had at the Harwick, in both hands, decisive and warm, and kissed him soundly. Yes, she said against his mouth. Yes to the logistical arrangement. Yes to all of it, She pulled back just far enough to look at him, and her eyes were warm and the stars were out, and the lamp he'd repaired was burning steady on the rock beside them, a small, reliable light in the Highland dark. "I choose you," she said, again, in case it wasn't clear the first 6 times. "It was clear," he said. "I just like hearing it." She laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first time he'd heard it unreserved like that, and he pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held, which he understood was its own kind of declaration from a woman who had spent her life needing no one to hold her up. The merchant contacts in the hill towns took 4 more days and were, in the end, straightforward. The merchant in question, a square-built woman named Hesta who ran 3 pack-mule trade routes between the foothills and the coast, had been avoiding the route that ran through the commission's operational area and had lost 2 months of trade income as a result. She was not pleased about this. When Rasha arrived with Corvin's warrant and the news of the injunction, Hesta's response was brief and practical. She wanted the route reopened, she wanted the paperwork in order, and she wanted assurance that the clan runners would be protected. Rasha gave her all 3 in the course of a 2-hour meeting, with Isaac present taking notes, and Hesta shook hands at the end with a grip that could have bent iron. They sent a rider south to Corvin's office with the news that the Northern Trade Network was reactivated and functioning. Corvin, Rasha had said, could use this as evidence for the assembly, an active, functioning trading relationship, operating legally under the Accords, the exact opposite of the Commission's characterization of the plateau situation. It was not a guarantee. The assembly was made of human men, and the Commission had allies, and the world was what it was, but it was a peace. An honest peace, placed in the right position. They turned south on the road again the following morning. The plateau in early autumn had changed even from a week earlier. The wheat was no longer gold but amber, drying toward the harvest, and the windmills turned with a new weight and urgency, as if they too were racing the season. The mornings were cold, and the middays warm, and the evenings came earlier, and the light had that particular quality of late summer where everything was both bright and slightly melancholy, the year looking back over its shoulder. Rasha walked with her long stride, and Isaac kept pace beside her, and they talked about everything. She told him more about the clan, the politics of it, the alliances with neighboring clans, the particular difficulties of maintaining old traditions in a world that kept pressing in from the south. He told her more about the lighthouse, the mechanical side of it, the record-keeping, the strange and solitary satisfaction of it, and how that satisfaction had been both real and not quite enough. They talked about what came next, practically. She would go north again before winter. The clan needed runners in the cold months, when the southern roads became difficult and the northern connections were essential. She would go and she would come back. He would keep the light burning. They would build the rest as they went, which suited them both, being people who had learned to navigate without a fixed chart. On the second day south, they passed through the area where the burning barn had been. The ruin of it was cold now, a blackened shell, the smell of old smoke still faint in the air, the grain that had been near it still dark and ruined. But someone had been at work on the site. There were fresh timber posts set in the ground, the beginning of a new structure, and 2 farmers were working on it in the late afternoon. Rasha stopped, looked at it. "They're rebuilding," Isaac said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good sign." It was. It was a small thing, 2 men with timber posts in the late summer light, but it was a small good thing, and in a world of hard things, small good things had weight. They picked up pace and kept moving south, and the windmills stood in their patient rows and turned in the coast wind, and the long golden plateau stretched away in every direction as far as anyone could see. Harwick received them differently on the return. Not with ceremony. This was not the kind of world that managed ceremony easily for the kinds of people they were, but with the particular quality of a place that had done something and knew it, the slightly lifted carriage of a town that had looked at something and not looked away. Corvin met them at his office with an update. The assembly had been formally convened. The commission's captain had lodged his appeal, as expected. 3 families released from commission custody had given depositions that were now part of the formal record. 2 of the commission's contracted local agents, the informal armband men who had been running the smaller checkpoints, had quietly removed their armbands and resumed their normal lives, which was the thing frightened people did when the official backing for their fear became uncertain. The assembly convenes in 2 weeks, Corvin said. It will be contentious. It should be, Rasha said. You should be there. He looked at her evenly. As a formal witness, if you're willing. She looked at Isaac. He looked at her. The look between them was brief and complete. We'll be there, she said. They spent the night at the Anchor's Rest again, and the innkeeper gave them the same room without being asked, and Rasha stood at the window looking out over the harbor, the ships at anchor, the harbor lights, the dark line of the straits, while Isaac sat on the edge of the bed and watched her. Corvin will fight for it, he said. I know. And even if the assembly doesn't rule the way we want, the network is running again. The trade is moving. The accords are on paper and they've been cited in a formal proceeding. He thought about it. Things don't break all at once, they crack. We've put something in the crack. She turned from the window. In the lamplight of the room she was extraordinary, and he had long since stopped trying not to look at her. She came to him. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed and took his face in her hands the way she always did, the most particular and personal gesture of everything between them, that taking of his face, the complete and unhesitating claim of it, and looked at him with those dark green eyes for a long moment that he had no desire to shorten. I was covered in ash when you looked at me, she said. Yes, he said, and you stared, completely. Most men would have. I'm not most men, he said. I don't say that to boast, I just mean, he thought about how to put it. I've been keeping a light on a cliff for 3 years because it matters that ships don't hit rocks in the dark. I know what it looks like when something is worth seeing. He held her eyes. You were absolutely worth seeing. She kissed him slowly and thoroughly, and the lamp burned warm and the harbor sounds came through the window and the night was quiet and good. And when she finally pulled back, she rested her forehead against his and they breathed the same air for a moment. I was afraid, she said. When I came out of those trees, I had been running for 2 hours and the camp was gone and I was hurt and alone, and I came out of the trees onto the road and there was a man staring at me and I didn't know what kind of staring it was. And then you knew. And then I knew. She drew back just enough to look at him. It was the most surprising thing that has happened to me in 29 years of being surprised by things. He brought her hands down from his face and held them. For me, it was the most important thing that has happened in 31 years of almost missing it. She leaned against him and he put his arms around her, and she allowed it with the complete and deliberate ease of someone who has decided, fully and without reservation, to be held. Outside, the harbor lights moved on the water and the straits were dark beyond the breakwater, and somewhere far up the coast the Cape Marin lighthouse was dark, its lamp unlit, its tower empty, the long arm of its signal still. But not for much longer. The Plateau Assembly convened in the Market Hall of Harwich on a Thursday morning, with a cold early autumn rain coming in off the straits, and 140 people packed into a hall built for 90. Isaac stood at the back where there was floor space, and Rasha stood beside him, no, in front of him, which was practical as she was taller and the view from behind her shoulder was just fine. The assembled representatives of the plateau were a varied bunch. Merchant guild members, farmstead holders, mill owners, harbor authority men, village headmen from as far north as the foothills and as far south as the Cape settlements. Among them, seated in the formal witness chairs at the front by Corvin's arrangement, were 4 human representatives from the Plateau Road communities, including the gray-haired farmwife from Thresket, who had spoken the names at the first hearing. Also in the witness chairs was Rasha. She sat with the same level chin and the same steady green eyes, and the same complete self-possession she had brought to every room she'd walked into since the first moment, and she was wearing the evergreen travel leathers, cleaned and relaced, the burned sleeve neatly repaired, and she sat among the human witnesses without any quality of apology or defensiveness, only the frank and grounded assurance of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Isaac watched her and felt something in his chest that was too large for the room. Sane's counsel made the commission's argument. It was a polished argument, formal, bureaucratic, invoking the Interior Council's authority and the public safety rationale of the purity resolutions with the smooth ease of someone who had made this argument before and had usually won. He spoke for 20 minutes. He cited statutes. He was impressive. Then the Thresket farmwife spoke, and she named not 4 families but 9, including 2 families whose houses had been stripped in the preceding month after commission writers found mixed-blood heritage in a church record. She spoke with the flat authority of someone recounting facts, without theatrics, and facts are hard to argue with when they are specific and witnessed, and the witnessing is credible. Then Rasha spoke. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She cited the border trade accords by article and section, from memory, without notes. She described the camp burning in the neutral language of an official report, and then she described the 6 weeks of commission operations on the plateau with the same tone, and then she described the harm, specific and named and real, and it was the most precise and devastating thing Isaac had heard in that room or likely any other room. When she finished, the hall was quiet in the particular way halls are when something true has been said clearly, and no one has an immediately credible answer. The assembly voted in the afternoon. It was not unanimous. Nothing honest ever is. 12 of the 38 representatives voted against the injunction extension and in favor of the commission's continued operation. 26 voted for the extension. Corvin declared the injunction formally extended for a period of 6 months, during which the Commission's mandate in the Plateau territory was suspended pending a review by the Interior Council itself. A review which the 26 Assembly members had formally requested, which was significant because the Interior Council could not easily ignore a formal regional assembly request without looking exactly as authoritarian as it was trying to avoid looking. It was not a final victory. The commission still existed. The resolutions were still on the books. But the mechanism was stopped in this territory, and the stopping was documented and public and backed by 26 representatives, and a magistrate with 30 years of credibility and a very pointed memory for whose correspondence had been tampered with. Sane left Harwick the following day with his soldiers. He did not speak to anyone on the way out. Isaac found Rasha outside Corvin's hall in the thin autumn sunshine after the vote, standing with the Thresket farmwife and 2 of the released from custody families, talking in the practical way of people who are already moving to the next problem. She saw him coming from a distance and did not stop talking, but her expression changed in that way it did the small shift that was only for him, that had nothing to do with the rest of the world. He waited until the conversation concluded and the others moved off before he came up beside her. 26-12, she said. Yes. It's not enough, she said. It's enough for now, not enough forever. No, he agreed. But it's enough to send word north, and enough to open the road again. And enough to let the accords work while the larger argument is being made. He looked at her. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. She looked northward across the harbor toward the plateau they couldn't see from this angle, toward the highlands beyond it. I need to go north again, take the news to my uncle, begin the next conversation. I know. I'll be back before the first deep snow. I know, he said. I'll be at the lighthouse. She turned to look at him with the full weight of those green eyes. You're going back today. The light's been dark for 2 weeks, he said. There's a ship coming through the straits on the next tide. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped forward and cupped his face in both hands, and he put his hands over hers. When I come back, she said. When you come back, he said, the storage room will be cleared. She pressed her lips to his, brief and warm and completely certain, and then she stepped back and straightened, and she was Rasha Wildheart again, fully herself, every inch of her turning to gather her pack and her messages and the whole purposeful momentum of her particular life. He watched her go to the stables where she'd arranged a horse. She was extraordinary on a horse, entirely unsurprising, and turned in the saddle to look at him one last time from across the courtyard. He raised his hand. She held his gaze for a moment, and the corner of her mouth moved, and she turned north and rode. He stood there until she was out of sight, which took longer than it should have because the road from the Harwick Civic Quarter was long and straight, and he could see her for a good while, and he was looking. He walked back through the town to the road south, and south was the headland path, and above it the lighthouse dark and waiting. He climbed the path at the same pace he'd climbed it his whole career, steady, not rushing, knowing the path. He reached the base and went up the spiral stairs and opened the lamp room. The lens was dusty, the wick needed trimming, the oil needed topping. He spent an hour getting everything right, moving through the familiar sequence of tasks with the efficiency of long practice, and when everything was in order he lit the lamp. The beam swept out over the straights, steady, certain, turning. He descended the stairs to the cottage. He went to the room he used for storage and stood in the doorway looking at the boxes and equipment and oil casks packed into it and began to plan. He could move the oil casks to the base room. The equipment could be reorganized on new shelving. The window in this room faced west, toward the plateau, toward the windmills, toward the road that ran north all the way to the foothills. Good window. He started moving crates. He worked until dark, and then he ate and sat at the table in the warm single room of his home, and outside the lighthouse beam was turning, and the straits were dark and quiet, and he could hear the distant sound of a ship's bell as something came through the passage safely, guided by the light. He opened his keeper's log, the official record, where he noted weather and lamp conditions and maintenance and ship sightings, the formal record that would be inspected and kept. He wrote the date, he wrote the lamp conditions, he wrote the weather, clear, wind northeast, first cold of the season. Then he wrote at the bottom of the entry in the same careful ink as everything else, so that it was part of the record, permanent and documented. Rasha Wildheart, returning before first snow. Cottage second room prepared. He closed the log. Outside the light turned. She came back on the last day of autumn when the wheat had been harvested and the stubble stood cold and silver in the low afternoon light, and the windmills turned slow and patient in the diminishing year. She came up the headland path with her pack and her belt blades, and the plaited cord on her belt where the empty sheath had been, and her hair loose in the wind off the straights, and Isaac saw her coming from the lamp room window where he'd been watching for 3 days and went down the stairs 4 at a time. He opened the cottage door, and she was there on the path, 10 feet away, and they looked at each other in the gray autumn light with the sea behind her and the lighthouse above him and the whole enormous open sky. The light was on, she said. Yes, he said, it was always going to be on. She crossed the last 10 feet and he stepped forward to meet her, and she walked into his arms with the assurance of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and he held her with the completeness of a man who has finally found what he was keeping the light for. Over her shoulder, the plateau stretched away northward, enormous and golden even in autumn, the windmills turning at their slow, patient intervals, the long road running through it all the way to the foothills, and beyond them the highlands, and beyond those the open country where everything continued. There was a whole road ahead. They were going to walk it together. Not forever in the sense of a settled, fixed thing, but in the truer sense the way a lighthouse light turns, steady and ongoing, reaching through the dark, marking the way for anyone who needed to find their way back. She pulled back from his arms enough to look at him. The second room, she said, cleared, he said, and there's a shelf built for your maps. The full smile. The real one, unguarded and extraordinary. Isaac Easton, she said. Rasha Wildheart, he said back. She took his hand, the one with the cord on the wrist, and held it, and they stood on the headland in the autumn wind with the sea sounding below them, and the light turning above them, and the whole open plateau north and west, and neither of them was done going. They would go south to testify before the Interior Council review in the spring. Corvin had already written asking for both of them. They would go north again when the clan needed Rasha's particular skills on the road. They would cross the plateau 100 times more, through its seasons and its weathers, and the windmills would turn over them, and the wheat would grow and be harvested and grow again. But tonight the light was burning and she was back, and the cottage was warm, and the second room had a shelf built for her maps, and that was the whole world, exactly as it needed to be. The lighthouse beams swept out over the dark water. Steady, certain, home.